My name's Graham Lucas. I'm a managing director for Michael Page, which is part of PageGroup, and I'm delighted to be hosting today's discussion. I'm going to do intros in a few moments' time, but I'm really pleased to be joined by Liz Reynolds, who joins us, and Steph Evans-Hill, who I'll come back around to shortly. Just in terms of a couple of bits before we kick off, you'll all be able to see there's a chat function where feel free as we're talking today, and certainly as Liz and Steph are walking us through a few slides and some of the pertinent points they brought to the discussion, feel free to stick a question in there. We've already had some questions submitted, so we'll try and work through as many as we can once we've got through the first part of the webinar. And before I do forget to say, other than get involved, my second thing that I needed to remember was to say the slides from today's session are going to be made available in the handout section, so you don't need to worry about scribbling notes too furiously. You can concentrate on asking the questions you want and getting involved, but they'll be shared on the handout section shortly. So look, I think why am I excited for today's discussion? And I think we've got a great topic to try and unpack today. We've challenged Liz and Steph to unpack something which is certainly wide-ranging, certainly of the moment, and not probably the simplest thing to digest down into bite-sized chunks. So we've got a big one to try and unpack, but I think it is incredibly well-timed for us to be having this conversation. I think a couple of bits that I thought might just help us all zone in on why we've kind of set the topic where we have. A few things with regards to kind of the labour market at the minute, and some of these you might be very aware of, some you might not, but a couple of headline bits. I think most people are feeling some of the challenges of being in what is a really incredibly competitive labour market. If you look at the unemployment rate from April, that was recorded at 3.8%, ever so slightly up from the 3.7 that was recorded through January, February and March. That, for context, is a 50-year low number, and that's in itself a remarkable headline. I think sat underneath that, we've got over 1 million workers that have left the UK payroll since COVID arrived on our shores. The bulk of that 1 million has dissipated from the 18 to 24 and the over 65s. They're the two age groups where we've seen most people step off, maybe for an early retirement, maybe to develop a side hustle into an income stream, or to do something entirely different. But that's certainly adding strain to some of the skill gaps and labour shortages that we're seeing. I think and one of the real big moments for me in March that really made me stop and notice some of that stuff was, for the first time ever in history, the UK had more job vacancies than there were unemployed people. And that in itself is just a remarkable place for us to find ourselves. So we've got this real tightness in the labour market. I think the second thing that I would call out that goes with that, we've had this permanent and fundamental shift with regards to what employees' relationships with the place of work, with employers. And in reality, we're going to touch on some of those things today. I'm sure flexibility will be part of that conversation, but I'm sure we're going to touch on lots of other things around D&I, around an organisation and a leadership team's social footprint, their environmental footprint, what they're doing around well-being. And in reality, I think if you look at what an employee expects of an employer, of a leadership team, and of a place of work, I think the demands are higher than they've ever been, and therefore you've got this real tightness in the labour market, which is really being kind of magnified in terms of challenge by these shifting expectations with regards to what people are expecting from a place of work. And I think therefore, certainly I'm lucky enough to talk to and meet lots of leadership teams week to week, month to month around the UK, working across different sectors. And I think, look, there's lots of similarities of some of the challenges people are facing, but I think one thing that is really clear, I think they're probably at different points of that journey and maybe are seeing different opportunities and challenges in different aspects of that. So yeah, I mean, I've got the easy job of hosting. I think Liz and Steph have got the harder job of trying to unpack some of that in not a huge amount of time. But yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion. So let me do intros and get out of the way so that Liz and Steph can start walking us through some of this stuff. So we are going to start with Liz, but just before we do that, I'm just going to introduce Steph, who I'm delighted to say joins us from Nestle. So Steph is the head of HR and works within Nestle, within their confectionery and digital parts of their business. Prior to the job that she was doing now, she was also has experience with Nestle Waters. And prior to that, Steph, I think, unless you're going to correct me, you've got experience of working with Saint-Gobain. For anybody who doesn't know Saint-Gobain, another big global business, manufacturer and distributor of building-related materials. Is that fair, Steph? I'm on point. So look, we're going to come to Steph, but we're actually going to start with Liz. So we're also delighted to be joined by Liz Reynolds, who is the People Director at 26. 26, for anybody who don't know them, are an award-winning, Liz, I'll give you that accolade, award-winning digital marketing business. And ultimately, I think probably most people would agree, you don't tend to win awards if people aren't at the heart of what a business is doing. Prior to that, Liz, I've tried to succinctly sum this up, Liz, so you can fill in any blanks.
Good luck.
We're lucky that Liz has got great experience having worked within PE firms and PLCs, and has also worked across a number of sectors, including obviously the one she's in at the minute, the tech, manufacturing, health, sales. So actually, I think that's part of the richness of today's discussion, trying to unpack where maybe different sectors and organisations are at with dealing with some of this stuff. So two great people to be joining us. Thanks both for your time. And Liz, if it's okay, I'm going to hand over to you for you to kick off the discussion.
Brilliant. Thanks, Graham. We're up for a challenge. I mean, you know, how hard could it be? As you say, it's very topical, and there's been a lot of research around what leadership means in this new era. There's loads of reports, lots of writing around it. So what I thought I'd do today is help you all with your research and shortcut a lot of the reading that I've been doing. And I'll give you a bit of a framework that I kind of lifted from an EY article that I read, but really it kind of crosses over into a lot of other areas. Cam, if you can move the slides on. The format I'm going to follow today is on the left here. And on the right, if you are interested in any things that I'm talking about, then all of those are links that will take you to further reading. So you can access the articles and the research directly if anything kind of resonates with you. Again, if we can click on. The EY literature in particular, and the CBI stuff, talks around the clusters of leadership skills that are more important perhaps in this era than they were 5 years ago. And a lot of these are the very, what we'd see as softer skills. So they talk about leaders needing to connect with employees in a much more human way. So this is all around leaders having less remoteness from the workforce, not having to have all the answers, making themselves more accessible, and really making, humanizing themselves. The link there that I've put about, one of the ways in which they can do this is around sharing personal stories. There's a link there to a blog that our chief exec Ryan wrote. I think he actually wrote it during lockdown, and it was around his experience of being promoted to CEO just before COVID hit. And in it, he talks about, as you can imagine, the challenges, that baptism of fire, how he coped with it, some of the practices he still uses today, and some of his philosophy. It's an interesting article in itself, but what makes it useful to us is that helps to connect him to, whether it's our candidates or our employees, they can see what kind of chief exec he is, what he values, and that the struggles that everyone's going through, it's not theirs alone. So I think it's important, partly for sort of destigmatizing some of the issues that people have, but just to make leaders more relatable. I've then gone on to talk about aligning benefits and promoting resources to show care and compassion. And I think it needs to not just be the people team who are promoting what's available to employees. And in fact, one of the questions we got before the session was around how do we get employees to engage with some of the benefits that we offer. And I think my answer to that is that it isn't just the people team's job. We do need to promote what we offer. And in fact, at 26, we're doing a kind of relaunch of our benefits, more sort of re-educating employees around what we offer and how they can get the best out of those benefits. But really, for us, the key part is getting our managers and our leaders articulating what those resources are and to encourage them. I think the other sort of key point where this has come to life for me has not been led from either the leadership team or the people team, but has been through enabling employees to help form part of the solution. And you're going to hear me talk about that quite a bit throughout this section. So to illustrate with an example, we've had a recent joiner who's had a lot of experience of mental health issues, and he wanted to start a morning meditation just to run it kind of remotely, 10 minutes, people can join or not join. We thought it was a great idea, so I went, yeah, get on with it. He runs that every day, loads of people drop in, and not every day, but it's available to everybody. So I can't take credit that we did anything in that regard, but we've created an environment in which employees can be part of the solution, which kind of linked me very neatly to the next point on the 4 enablers of engagement, which I'm sure many of you will have come across this work before by David McLeod and Nita Clark. There's a link there to, it's called Engage for Success, their organisation. And they identified these 4 enablers, which their argument is you can't make people be motivated and engaged, but all you can do is create an environment in which engagement will happen. And there's actually a hidden slide for those of you who want to download it, who want more information, but I'll talk through the 4 pillars, which the first is all around strategic narrative. And this links back to the leadership skills, because what leaders need to particularly be able to do at the moment is articulate the organisation's journey, where we've come from, where we're going to, what the purpose of the organisation is. And by which I don't mean, without naming any previous organisations that I've worked for, sometimes that goal is just the financial, we want to be $1 billion business, which is exciting to no one. We need to hear the story about where we're going, what we're doing for our clients, what difference we've made in the world. And when leaders can bring that to life in a passionate and engaging way, the other enablers follow. For me, one of the most important ones is then about managers, empowered managers who can stretch and coach their people, give them interesting work, treat them as individuals, because it's the manager who connects the individual to the organisation day to day. So there's a whole piece of work to be done around that. Employee voice is the 3rd enabler. So this is kind of like with the example I was just sharing around the morning meditation. It's make employees part of the solution. It doesn't all have to come from leadership. And where employees are central to the solution and their voices are heard beyond your engagement surveys, beyond your polls and forums, that is where engagement will happen. And finally, organisational integrity. So again, I can illustrate perhaps with an example. One of the things we've realised with 26 as we move into this new era is some of our values need revisiting, because there's a different way of working and we need to connect with people differently. So we're taking this as an opportunity to refresh and relaunch our values. And I think the trend really that we've seen post-COVID, or perhaps that COVID has accelerated, is the move away from command and control towards engagement for organisations who are really looking to attract and keep the best talent. And my final point here is really from the CVI, who talk about, it's a similar cluster of skills that they talk about that leaders need. It's around collaboration, team building, change management, resilience, empathy, and that some of these skills are harder to develop. I think the view that I have on this is that I think it's perfectly possible to develop all of these skills so long as leaders are interested. And I've included just a couple of links there. One is to some training resources, and the other is the empathy experiment, which I'll create. This is one of the things I love about working with creatives. They send you all kinds of random stuff. So our creative director sent me this. I think he actually likes the design of it's kind of like a choose your own adventure game for empathy. So you pick your response and it gives you empathy scores. It's quite playful. I think it's just a useful L&D resource. But again, all of these things can bring how to develop empathy or whatever the softer skills are to life. And I'll talk in a little while about some of the L&D challenges that brings. If we can click through to the next slide. For me, this is one of the, I think probably one of the most important aspects is the importance of flexibility, because things are continuously changing, and what's been working for the last couple of months might not work next month. But that applies equally to employees as well as to leaders and managers. So the importance of being able to move with the times. And here I want to also make the link to, again, one of the questions that we were asked earlier around how this works with equality and diversity and inclusion. I think leaders need to, if we've all got this challenge, we've all got the recruitment challenge of trying to find talent, like Graham just outlined in the market, we've lost 1 million people off payroll. Well, one of the biggest groups that are finding it hard to reconnect with work are some of the underrepresented groups. So young workers, older workers, sorry, women, and neurodiverse candidates. So there's a whole talent pool there waiting to be recruited. But the IES study showed that a lot of employers are not really engaging with that group to think about what they need to return to work. So I would argue that as these groups have a very strong preference for hybrid, the link there is to a McKinsey report that kind of talks all about that. So hybrid and flexible working can be part of that talent solution. One of the things we've realised at 26 is that we are a really flexible employer, but what we've not done well enough is to actually promote that both to employees and to new candidates that we're trying to attract. So I think there's a link there to being able to articulate what it is that you're prepared to offer. I appreciate that not all roles and not all tasks loan themselves to hybrid and flexible working, but a lot of them do when you challenge yourself. Also linked to this is the kind of work that we're looking at is redesigning some of our processes and to make sure and kind of think about them in the context of, are they inclusive enough? Are they actually looking at the right factors? So taking performance management, for example, are we really measuring on outputs, or are some of these behaviours really linked to being kind of socially connected and therefore linked to proximity bias? So we're taking a long, hard look at our performance management, coupled with retraining some of our managers to make, to keep ourselves aware of those kind of biases that come into play. One of the strongest things, though, that we're doing at the moment is this third point around setting clear expectations. And it's been interesting to compare kind of our experience to what we've seen some of our competitors doing. And like with all these things, there's a spectrum from super flexible to really quite rigid. And we've seen quite a lot of mandates about return to the office for 2 days or 3 days or whatever it is, with some choice around that. But we've taken a different view, which is coming back to, well, we're not really positioning it as coming back to the office, but around spending 40% of your working time approximately, and again, not applying to all roles, with your colleagues. And we need to create a great office that enables that. So the 4 reasons we talk about coming into either the office or a workspace that works for you, can be a cafe, can be a walking meeting or whatever, is for connection, collaboration, communication, or for culture. And those are things that we're finding much harder remotely. So if you're doing deep focus work and you need concentrating time or planning time, or if you're in the middle of a project, that's probably time you should spend at home, earphones on, focus on your keyboard and work. If you're at the start of a project, because we work in an agile way and it's a sprint and you need to connect with your colleagues at the beginning, or if you need some collaboration with clients, well, those are obviously the times that you need to be connecting with others. So we need to do, and I'll come on to this in a minute, we need to do a bit more work to enable some of that through our office setup. But I think the key point here is to start with the purpose. And I've included a quick link to one of my favourite talks, which is the Simon Sinek, How Great Leaders Inspire Action. Spoiler alert, start with the why. So we're continuously articulating, why are we asking you to do this? If we can click through to the next slide. Brilliant. Informal and social learning. So I've put a quick quote on the right there, which shows, I think, or illustrates the appetite there is at the moment for learning development. We're finding it from candidates, from employees, from managers. People are really passionate to learn, and they kind of feel that their career progression and their career development has been on hold a little bit for the last couple of years. So a lot of people invested their own time and their own money into additional, whether it's e-learning, online learning, remote learning, webinars, etc., etc. And I think that's an important part of the mix. But if we click through to the next slide again, the view that we've come to is flexible learning is great and self-directed learning is great, but it's only part of the puzzle. For things like knowledge sharing, that works really well remotely or in person. It doesn't have to be the same time and the same place. So like this webinar, you can watch over coffee, or you can watch in the evening, or you can watch during work time, and that's fine because it can be asynchronous. But where you're developing skills, and this is where we perceive some of the gaps, it's much better. It doesn't have to be done in person, but it's much better to be done in person, and it definitely has to be done synchronously, because you need to practice something, get some feedback, and then practice it again to start cementing those skills in a safe environment. So we've started running, when we do workshops for managers or like employee inductions, when we're trying to make connections, and back to that, connect, collaborate, communicate, and culture. For those reasons, we're saying come into the office. You know, it just works better. And I think the final point here is it's kind of linked back to that point about flexibility. We're an agile organisation, so our view is very much try it. It either works or it doesn't. Get feedback, redesign if you need to redesign. And I think one of the factors that organisations and leaders need to be mindful of is their attitude to risk going forwards, because in an organisation that's prepared to fail in a minor way, get things wrong, you're going to accelerate learning. If people are punished for getting things wrong, or there's a culture and environment which inhibits that, you're not going to get your learning and people are not going to progress. And if they're not progressing, they're not going to stay. And here we are in that same cycle again. If we can click onto network building. Thank you. So I think the first point I wanted to make here, and it is kind of an obvious one, it's just more work. It's more work for everybody, whether it's employees or managers or leaders. The onus is on everyone to create and recreate networks that used to be a lot easier to make. And again, I'm going to refer to one of the questions that came through. You know, my view on this is networks are not as strong if they're not in person. So you do have to find ways to bring people together. Now, the way in which we've approached this is we've looked at the key touch points in the employee life cycle. We've completely reviewed how we do our onboarding and induction, what opportunities we have to bring people together to connect them. So some obvious stuff that's been around for years. So, but making sure they have, you know, their buddy, so that somebody they've got an immediate connection with. We do some network lunches. We bring people in for group inductions. Other things like team and company introductions, they can be done remotely or they can be done in person, depending on kind of what's going on with that person. I think it's also important to say, and like I said, the theme here is around empowering managers, that one size doesn't fit all. So we've realised our managers need to own a lot more of this. It's not a central and it's not a blanket problem. So we've given our managers budget and a remit to establish and, you know, reinforce the connections within their team and across teams. I think we're still at the start of our journey there, but that's been kind of our first step. And then more centrally, the things that we're trying to do, I mean, we've got some great people in our people team are really good at, you know, leveraging, for example, we use focus weeks. So whether it's learning at work week, mental health, we recently had Pride Week last week, and charity events, making it an excuse to bring people into the office and accepting you're going to have slightly lower productivity on those days, but it will flow out over the week and that you will get those returns, but in a different, sometimes, you know, it's not an A equals B kind of measure, but you will get much more out of people in the long run. And then my final point on hybrid communication. This is, I think we're really lucky in that we've got a great agile coach within the organisation, and he's helped us to start setting, because we all kind of started using Teams, Zoom, whatever, by default and by accident, and we all kind of know how to use it. But when you actually learn some of the functionality that's there, it really enabled us to do a lot better, slicker communication than we would have done otherwise. And I guess the themes here are that we've moved away from sort of centrally controlled and managed communication. We still have things like monthly town halls and updates and so on and so forth when they happen, but we've actually pushed the responsibility down, not just to managers, but also to employees through the various team channels and that kind of stuff, to share information when it's timely, when it's relevant, and putting the onus back out rather than kind of bringing it all in to share it back out. We've done some training, as I say, in kind of hybrid meetings. I think that's a new world for all of us. And I think my final point here, which again I alluded to earlier, is we're early on the journey here, but in terms of redesigning our office space to enable the kind of connections that we want. So we've kind of set, this is an employee-led forum again, we've set them the challenge of what can we do with the office to make it work better for you? Initially, assuming no budget, we have actually got CapEx that we're going to put into the office, but let's see what we can do first. Let's learn from it and get those learnings for almost free. So for example, instead of, you know, banks of desks, let's reorganize the desks so it encourages collaboration. And then we'll use the budget for example, creating some quiet spaces if people want to come in to work quietly, or the tech that will enable better collaboration. Again, we're at the start of that journey, but it is quite an exciting time. So I think that's it from me. I'm going to hand over now to Steph, who's going to take some of these points and bring them to life in a little bit more of a practical way.
Thank you, Liz. Great session, and I certainly learned a lot from that. It's always good to get an insight into how different organisations and different industries and sectors approach this as well. So my name is Steph Evans-Hill. As Graham's mentioned, I work for Nestle. I work in one of our commercial businesses, but I've also got a background within our manufacturing teams as well. So this whole space of how does leadership evolve in 2022, trying to think of this through the lens of what does it mean for our office and staff-based populations, but also those valued employees and colleagues who work in operations and distributions as well. It's not always been easy to do that in the right way. So I'm just going to spend a few moments now just taking you through and building on some of Liz's points on how leaders must evolve to meet today's challenges, because one thing that's absolutely clear, whether you read it through the research, whether you speak to anybody in the industries, whether you attend any webinars, the leadership that was needed for 22 and prior is not the leadership that's going to be fit for purpose in 22 and beyond. So I think it's an exciting time. It's definitely an opportunity, but it's something that leaders and organisations need to be thoroughly deliberate over. So Cam, if you could move on for me, please. Okay, so taking it down to the next level, we've looked at this and what it means for leaders through the lens of culture, learning and well-being, which are three massively important areas that aren't always easy to measure. They're definitely not always easy to manage, but they're three areas that will have a massive impact and massive payback if leaders get this right. So again, if you could move on for me, please, Cam. I'm trying not to sound too much like Chris Whitty, so I'll try and do it naturally. So I'm sure we've all heard of this quote a million times before. Culture is the way we do things around here, and that's always the easiest thing for me to remember when I'm trying to explain what culture is to someone. It's the way that we do things around here. It's almost the unsaid word. It's the behaviours, it's the norms, it's how things get done, and it's just the way things happen. But where is around here when we're no longer all together in the office? That's the key challenge through this. So culture is now more important than ever. If there was something that was needed to bring people together and to be together, even though at times we're apart, it's going to be culture. So I've got 4 icons here. I'm going to start with the one on the left, which builds on Liz's point around creating that clear, compelling purpose. We're in the midst of this famous Great Resignation. So the big question that employers and leaders should be asking themselves is, why should your employees work for you? What is it about you and your organisation and your leadership that means that your employees should spend their time and their effort and their energy working for you rather than taking all of that brilliance somewhere else? If you're not able to define that, and you're not able to have a clear, compelling, exciting, engaging place, then you're not going to be winning those hearts and minds maybe as easily as you did before the pandemic. So repeat it every chance you can, that clear purpose. What's the North Star? Where is the organisation going and why? Make it beyond the numbers and the facts and the figures of the organisation. What's the deep meaning? What is the company doing to contribute to society? Whether that's to make a difference to people, whether that's making a difference to the planet, what is it that's going to get people getting out of bed in the morning and really be excited and energized because they know they can make a difference in your company? So repeat it every chance you can and be really explicit on how your team can contribute to that vision. The second one is recognize the behaviors that you want to reinforce through your culture. So what are the behaviors you want to encourage? How do you celebrate them publicly? Make sure that all of your people processes reinforce those behaviors that you want. So actually, if part of your culture that you want to create and foster and harness is about innovation, well, recognize those behaviors. Don't recognize people staying within their comfort zone and not taking risks. Recognize and reward people who, want to be creative, want to be innovative, want to push the boundaries, and reinforce that at every chance you can. The third one, Liz has mentioned it, but the power of stories cannot be underestimated, especially when we're not always together. Encourage your teams and especially your leaders to share their story. This is really hard because not all leaders like to show vulnerability and like to show what's really going on for them, but what are they feeling? What are they learning? What are the challenges that they've had to wrap their heads around? What do they believe in? How has their leadership changed and what are they working on? Because if they can share that story, it helps build that human connection because it's bringing a personal human part to that relationship. And then the final point here on this slide is encourage your teams to connect every and any way they can, especially in a hybrid world. Not everybody's going to be in a room at the same time. So how do you invite those people in that are joining virtually? How do you make sure that if you have half of the people in the room and maybe a few people dialing in, that those people on the call aren't forgotten about? You know, what's the etiquette? Do you expect people to raise their virtual hand? Who's going to invite them in? How do they get to raise their question without interrupting the flow of the talk in the room? It's much harder when you're joining virtually, and it's much easier to feel like an outsider and that you're intruding on a meeting. So having those conversations up front, how you invite people in is critical. And make your work environment as collaborative as possible. So certainly within Nestle, we've fundamentally changed a lot of how our York office, which is where I'm based, operates. So in the past, pre-pandemic, we'd have rows and rows and banks of desks, and the majority of people would go into the office and we'd be on a call all day, and we wouldn't necessarily interact with the people around us. Now there's much more choice. So today I'm on this webinar, I'm on a number of phone calls. Actually, it's not appropriate for me to be in the office because I'm not going to engage and interact with people. Later on this week, there'll be chances for me to communicate and collaborate with people that I've not seen for a long time. That's much better for me to do in person, and you get that deeper sense of connection. So think about and be creative with the spaces that you have. You know, can you avoid these banks of desks and these rows of desks? Or can you create some open space, lots of whiteboards, lots of inspiring material, maybe space that people can move around in to just encourage people to come together? And then how do you remove some of the barriers that you know, people have had to navigate around through the pandemic? So just before this call, I had a delivery. If I was in the office, I would have missed that delivery. So something really simple. Does your office, does your work environment make it okay to have deliveries to the office? Because otherwise I would have had to stay home to accept that delivery. So, you know, it's removing those small things to encourage people to make the right choice in terms of where they work. Okay, next slide, please, Cam. So this next slide, it's all focused on learning and the way that we learn, especially for new starters or people joining an organisation or maybe haven't been as close to the team for a while. There are massive challenges around the way that we learn. So what this chart shows you on screen is that the majority of the way that we learn as human beings, it's all about observation, it's all about demonstration, practicing with others, teaching others. It's all about interaction and creating those places and joining those dots with other people. That's really hard when you're not together. So actually, how do you create an environment where learning can happen and can be cemented despite not being physically together? And I've got a few ideas. Some things I've seen in the external environment, some things happen within my own business that I'd love to share with you. So Cam, if you could move on for me, please. So the first one, Liz already alluded to it, but she didn't call it this, gamification of learning. So it sounds a bit cliche, but make learning fun. How many events and how many training courses have we been on where it's literally one person talking for hours and hours and hours with a slide full of text, and you leave the session and 2 days later you can't remember what you learned or what was said. Actually, bring a bit of fun into this. So make it a lot more interactive. Could there be a competitive element to it? Could there be prizes? Could there be an interactive way that they move through the learning so they see their journey? And this is certainly something that Nestle is doing more and more to bring learning to life, because we're doing much more over a virtual platform now. The second icon that you'll see there is the difference between the brain of someone who hasn't taken a break for a long time versus someone who has taken a break. So again, something very simple, but totally within our gift. Build regular breaks into the training courses that you have. The more breaks that you have, the more you're avoiding distractions, because you're able to keep that person's attention for much longer. So if you have a really long session, whether it's a meeting or training course, the longer it goes on, the more people will be distracted through things pinging on their phone, messages, knocks on the door, whatever it is that's going to take attention away from that learning. So build breaks in at regular intervals, give people that permission to switch off, if only for 10, 15 minutes or so, before bringing their attention right back into what they're learning about. Okay, next slide. So learning styles. This is something that I really think that organisations and leaders should talk much more about, because not everyone learns in the same way. I'm a very kinesthetic leader, and I like to practice things. I have to learn by doing and putting it into practice so that it finds its way in there and I remember it for the long term. If I hear it, I'm probably going to forget it after a few days. I've got to apply it. But that's not the same for everybody. So is there a way before your training courses, as leaders, as HR professionals, could you ask your participants to do a short assessment? There's loads of them online. What learning style do they have? And how do you weave that into your training program to make sure that you're meeting the needs of your audience? Encourage follow-up and ask for reflection. Ask them to discuss their learnings with their line manager and ensure that those conversations are going on as they go through the program. A good question for them to be asked is, what does success look like? What's going to be the difference that you're going to see in the way that you act, the way that you lead, the way that you carry out this activity after going on that training course? And following up after the session helps to cement that. And then the final point is this CPD, continuous professional development. Encourage regular reflections. Get them to keep that learning log. What did they learn? How is it helping them to plug their gaps? And it's really going to help, especially people like newer starters, to just log the things that they're learning and the difference that it's making. And encouraging them to go back and think through, actually, I've learned quite a lot through that, and what was the reason for that? How far have I come? Okay, next one for me, please, Cam. And we're going to move finally on to wellness. So I think COVID has fundamentally changed the game of well-being forever. If we cast our minds back pre-February, March 2020, before we even knew about COVID, when we spoke about wellness and well-being, we probably spoke about mental health, more in the place of stress or depression or anxiety. Wasn't spoken about that much, but it was starting to. But predominantly a lot of people felt much more comfortable talking about physical well-being and physical wellness. Then COVID hit, and some people's lives, certainly the majority of people's lives, fundamentally changed for a long time. And the door opened to much more mature and sensitive and caring conversations from leaders asking their team, how are you? How are you doing? How are your family? How's your mental health? What are you struggling with at the moment? And those conversations seem to be made much more okay and much more natural, because we were all dealing with this global pandemic. The challenge now is that when people start to go back to the office, how do we keep the richness of those conversations? How do we as leaders make sure that when we ask, how are you, we're not just doing that in a performative way to then move on to business. We're asking, no, really, how are you? Tell me, share with me what challenges you're going through. How can I support you? So I'd really encourage people to think about how they keep that front of mind and create this culture where people can tell you honestly how they're feeling and not lose that, because I think that was a real benefit through COVID, that forced that agenda. We can't afford to lose that. But the conversation is the most important thing. So employees might be a bit cynical if you've put a fruit ball out every Friday, but you overwork the teams. So having a genuine dialogue, talking to them regularly about their well-being and put in place things that you commit to do, it will absolutely go a long way. And I think I'm going to leave you with a final slide, which is a quote that I absolutely love, and every opportunity I get a chance to share it, I do. So, the best way to predict the future is to create it. Abraham Lincoln said it however many hundreds of years ago. And the reason that I like this quote is because there's so much change happening at the moment, and possibly for a long, long time for leaders. There's so much change out there, meaning that we can't always be sure that what we're doing makes a difference. We don't always know whether what we do will stick or whether it's the right thing. But actually, as a leader, if you believe in creating a culture, a learning environment, and a place where wellness can thrive, you've got to create that. Don't wait for that permission to be granted to you. Set the standard, and other leaders will follow you. So create those conditions for people to be and bring their best, and you'll absolutely go a long way. Okay, so I think we're now about to move into a poll. So a huge thank you, and really looking forward to seeing what questions people have.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Steph and Liz. Some really, really good points and brilliantly bang on time. So amazing job. Just before we do, we've got some questions that we're going to try and get through as many as we can. But just before we do, we're going to kick off a quick poll. So for anybody who can reach for the mouse, I think Cam will be loading that up now. But we're posing the questions. So I suppose, look, Steph and Liz have raised a really strong number of points. None of them probably new to many of us, but we're all at different points of the journey. As a leader, which of these areas do you think requires the most investment from you in the coming 6 months? We can get a temperature check of where people feel they're at. That'd be interesting. Let's give that another second. Oh, wow. Okay. So it's interesting. I was talking to Liz and Steph before we went live, and I said I have no idea whether there will be one single clear area or whether it will be fairly split. But that is interesting in itself, and a pretty clear two. But certainly maintaining culture seems to be the hot topic. Liz, Steph, does that surprise you? Does that resonate with kind of what you're seeing, hearing, working on yourselves?
No, it doesn't surprise me at all. I think culture, what's the famous quote? Culture eats strategy for breakfast. I think it's absolutely key. And actually, if you get your culture right, the rest will follow. You know, if you have a culture of openness, of kindness, of compassion, then you're probably going to create the space for people to have the right conversations around well-being, or actually how to have great conversations about leadership and learning. So I'm not surprised by that. I would have answered it in the same way. Liz, what do you think?
Absolutely, same thing. I've always been a passionate advocate for engagement. It's, aside from the fact, as I say, strategy for breakfast, engagement is the thing that fills in the gaps between your processes, and because ultimately it's people that make things work. So you might have great tech and great processes and wonderful systems, but there's always gaps. There's always things that don't work. So you need your people to connect those things together and to make the organisation work. And also, I mean, there's loads of studies and stuff out there that show this, is if you've got an engaged workforce, they tend to score, if you can imagine like a 4-grid box, they tend to score highly on both well-being and productivity, and you'll be in the top right. Whereas if you've got high productivity, low well-being, they're going to burn out. And doing anything that's the low productivity, you're not going to have a successful organisation. So to me, engagement definitely is the answer. And how you enact that is going to be different in every organisation. But I think the starting point is always listening to your people and going back to that employee voice, understanding their world. We're back to empathy again, that leadership skill, understand what's going on with them, listen to them, and that should inform what you need to do to help engage people better.
Yeah, great points. So I'm gonna push us along because we've got lots of questions to try and work through. So Liz, I'm going to start with you and just reference, you mentioned the words proximity bias in the bits that you're doing, but I'll start with you. Steph, if you've got anything to add, feel free to jump in. But I remember going back a few years where actually this kind of disruption to the way people were working I was talking to lots of leaders, lots of HRDs, lots of CPOs, but lots of leaders anyway, where there was certainly a real excitement initially around, location and work becoming more flexible, really allowed a potential acceleration with regards to some of the work that's ongoing around D&I. And actually, you've talked around some of those latent talent pools that maybe organizations historically haven't done as well as they'd like tapping into. But I read a Gartner study last year, I think it was, at the end of the year, where I'm going to say 74%, I might be a couple of percent out, but 74% of line managers said they believe they were more likely to promote somebody who spent more time in the office. And I suppose promotion succession is one aspect of that, and it seeps into culture and all sorts of stuff. But what's your view on how this disruption, does potentially either opportunity or risk-wise affect what everybody's trying to do from a D&I perspective?
It's a really good question. I think the main opportunities come from, I've kind of talked about the recruitment side of things already, and in terms of connecting people. I think the risks are that obviously we've got the out of sight, out of mind. So working out how to level the playing field, I think, is challenging in all organisations. I think, again, taking through some of the themes that I've talked about, some of this is around whenever you design something, whenever you do something, you need to think about your audience. And the way we talk about it is remote first. So think about, I don't know, if you're going to run this meeting, for example, and a couple of people can't make it, or they're going to be, maybe somebody's not in the same place and somebody else is not going to make it at all. How are you going to make it easy for them to catch up? Because what you don't want is the next day, the person who missed it has to sit through the entire hour to kind of understand what was said. So, for example, we've put protocols in place so that you kind of time mark the meeting. So, key discussion points are at blah, 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 and actions are at, this time point. And other kind of little hacks, like if you're having a meeting in the office, you might use, we've got that one of those camera things that kind of swirls around. But we've also worked out that if everyone has the laptop on, not necessarily so having it all muted so you don't have 1,000 echoes, but the person who's sitting at the end of the camera feels more connected than they would if they were in the room. Obviously, they're kind of micro examples, but the point I'm trying to make is you need to think through all your interactions, whether it's a meeting, whether it's a process redesign, whether it's who am I going to give that stretching client work to. It's having that thought process before you just do what's instinctive, which will be, oh, you're sat next to me, let me give that to you. It's making managers a lot more mindful. So some of that, I think, can be achieved through some training. And this is a slightly side point, but I actually quite like it. I know that there are some issues with it, but the Harvard IAT tests, if you've seen some of the implicit bias tests, I think it's good just for holding the mirror up and giving people that little, oh, there is something going on there. But also, as a team, part of our role is to challenge managers and leaders. So when, for example, quite often they'll submit a role that they want recruiting for, and almost automatically it's full time. So one of our challenges is always, really? Does it need to be full time? Could it be part time? Could it be compressed hours? What's the actual flex that we can manage here? So I think through that continuous challenge, there's an opportunity to encourage more diversity. If that answers your question.
Right answer. Yeah, Steph, I didn't know whether you anything to add that Nestle are experiencing.
Yeah, no, completely agree with everything that Liz has said. The only thing I would say is this needs to be a leadership topic, not just a HR topic, and for leaders to be deliberately inclusive. There's quite a good quote that I saw on the internet. I don't know who said it. Don't ask me to tell you who said it, but it said, if you don't intentionally include, you will unintentionally exclude. So yeah. Think about those people who are probably going to be in the office less often are going to be people with care and responsibilities, whether that's childcare, elderly relatives, whatever, they're going to have care and responsibilities. Possibly going to be people with disabilities, whether physical, mental, or neurodivergent, or people who live far away from the office. So think about, as leaders, all of that talent that you're missing out on if you're just going to those people who are right there next to you every day. And I think through the conversations that you have around all of your people processes, but particularly areas such as recruitment, succession planning, sponsorship, who gets those juicy projects, always asking that question, is this the right profile for this? Actually, how are we best representing those people who maybe aren't in the office as much? What opportunities are being given? And deliberately weaving that into all of your conversations now. Because in theory, you know, we're talking about the Great Resignation, we've got so many more vacancies than people who are unemployed. You need as much great talent as you can get. Why would you want to cut off part of that from your workforce? So I think it's really important, but the key is to be deliberate in conversations.
Yeah, like, I wrote the word, you used it when you were working through your slides, but I think that deliberate word is such a good word. And I think, Liz, you know, I think, you know, one of the other things we're certainly seeing across organisations is you've got this dynamic of skill shortages and you know, challenges around talent. There's also an element of exhaustion in the fact that actually, you know, lots of people have been working really hard under a lot of pressure for a long time. And I think therefore, the danger with that is that autopilot, you know, that immediacy of what we always done. Well, let's just do that, you know, and that element of, you know, not maybe forcing yourself to stop and think about, you know, to your point of full-time, part-time, remote, home, and all those other good things. But I think, you know, deliberately creating the space to allow leadership teams to really question themselves. I think it segues in nicely to another question we've got around what good examples are you seeing where organisations are getting this right from an inclusion perspective. Feel free to plug your own firms, but yeah, and maybe a little bit more controversially, any you think you're seeing where people are getting it wrong. Steph, maybe chuck that one at you.
Yeah, sure. And look, you know, I'm incredibly proud to work for an organisation like Nestle where these kind of conversations happen often and they happen very genuinely. So it's not done in a performative, let's have it tick box. A lot of these conversations aren't led by HR, they're led by leaders. So, you know, I think it's fantastic to be part of that. In terms of organisations that maybe haven't done it so well, there are two that come to mind. So the first one, I'm sure a lot of people will remember when they hit the headlines, when Jacob Rees-Mogg pinned that lovely note to all of his civil servants saying something along the lines of, "You weren't in the office when I called today. It'd be great to see you soon." And it was quite passive aggressive, but it set the expectation of, where are you? I can't see you, and therefore, how do I know that you're working and performing? The second example, which is quite similar, was a recent one again that hit the headlines from Elon Musk, saying that, you know, he expected his workforce to be physically in the office for at least 40 hours before they can to work from home. And I think both of those examples stuck with me because they just scream out to me a lack of trust that, you know, a lot of future employees and candidates may look at those employers and those areas and think, do I want to work for an organisation where I'm watched, where I'm asked to be physically present all the time, and actually where I have no agency of choice? Or do I want to work for an organisation that trusts that I will make the right decision and I will find the right balance? So I'll connect with my colleagues, but also I get to work on the work in the way that is best for me. Why would you not want to work for that kind of organisation? So I think personally, I think it's short-sighted to be so binary to say you're either all in or all out. I think that the secret is making the blend work and trusting employees as adults to make the right decision for them.
It's interesting, isn't it, that with both of those two examples, the way in which that's been expressed has been really quite passive aggressive towards the employees, rather than engaging in an adult conversation where, you know, I talked a little bit already about set out the why. Why do I need to be in the office all the time? For some roles, I can totally see that that's absolutely valid, and certainly for some tasks, but it's not treating your employees like adults, is it? It's you know, I think that tells you a lot about the culture, regardless of the expectations of where you work.
Yeah, agreed. Liz, I've got another question which I'll push to you if we can. which is ultimately around training and development, which is a topic we've touched on today. And a question, so I'll read it out. T&D seems to be coming under a lot of pressure. Most of this seems to be repurposing previous content and courses. Are you seeing any new focus areas being supported on the T&D agenda based on these leadership skills changes? Sorry, a bit of a long one, but
yeah, it's interesting. I think it very much depends on your organisation's journey and where you're going with your employees. For us, one of our responses to the talent shortage is to recognise that, well, you know, we can keep continuing to fight in the very experienced space, which, you know, there's loads of salary inflation, there's very few candidates. For certain roles, it's really important, but longer term, we think we need to invest more in more sort of early career talent. And that's come with, if you like, a side order of, well, to do that, we're going to need to invest in learning and development to enable them on that journey, because otherwise there's no point recruiting early career talent and then not supporting them to become the experienced. You know, we tend to talk about, you know, one of the, going back to Steph's point around why should people work for you, one of our things that we sell ourselves on is you will get to work with industry leading experts. You know, we've got world-class people in data science and creative, and, you know, it's exciting to work with those people. So if you want to become our next expert, well, we're going to have to help you to get there. So those things all connect, in my view. I think the other sort of key themes that we're seeing is, you know, I've talked a lot about those skills that leadership need to develop and that managers need to develop. Now, I think innately they're quite natural for some people, but others are going to have to learn them, and we're going to need to support them in that. So for us, management development is really important, leadership development is really important, and there's a combination of kind of in-house development, and we've also brought in some external consultants. And one of the key themes that we've been working on is around collaborative problem solving and systemic leadership. So the pandemic and lockdown have forced, or perhaps reinforced, more siloed and focused working. People, I think, are generally a lot more productive, but quite often in their own swim lane. What we're trying to say is we need to actually work much more in a holistic way, looking across the organisation, particularly at leadership level. So we're actually investing quite a lot in training development rather than putting the pressures on. I accept that a lot of L&D people are having to repurpose, you know, this was, I don't know, a day's workshop on interview skills. Well, it's now a 2-hour online e-learning module. And I go back to my earlier point around, it depends what you're trying to develop. If you're trying to just teach people stuff, or it's potentially like compliance or audit related training, I get it, e-learning is a really good solution. If you're trying to enact behavioural change or skills development, you have to have the ability to practice and to get feedback, and you can only do that like with other live subjects. You can't, you know, you can, I know to a degree, kind of go through that process with, like I said earlier, the choose your own adventure game on the empathy, but there's no substitute for actually being put in a situation, something where it's going to stretch you and you're going to struggle a little bit, but it's a safe environment. So then when you go out and try and do that with your employees, you're going to have developed, and this is the other gap that I'm actually seeing at the moment, the confidence to be able to do what it is that you need to do. So I think, you know, there's different scenarios for different organisations, but certainly that's how we're experiencing things. I don't know if that's the same for you, Steph.
Again, agility is key by the sounds of it, in terms of, you know, not being one thing. I'm conscious of time, and we are just about to wrap up, so I'm going to ask you both just before we do for one top tip. So you haven't got long, unfortunately, but you could sum up one takeaway that you'd kind of emphasise, maybe from some of the stuff you covered. Steph, I'm going to start with you.
Yep. So look, for me, it's do one thing which doesn't cost anything, but just creates that deliberate care and just takes a little bit of energy. Reach out and connect with those people who maybe you don't see that often because they're not on your list of people that I need to talk to today. Have conversations with people, and you'll be surprised what you'll learn.
Great one. I'm leaving with too many actions today. Liz, one from you.
Yeah, I agree with Steph. I think those little marginal gains and small changes. I think I read a really interesting thing on micro goals. So instead of trying to, you know, boil the ocean, like it was a particular running coach, and she lost her motivation with running, and instead of trying to run 5K every day, she set herself the objective of, I'm just going to run to that lamppost every day. And almost every day when she did, she would carry on and do a few more, miles or whatever. But running to the lamppost is a lot easier than starting off to do a 5K. So actually, I'm going to reinforce what Steph said, just in a slightly different way, but just run to the lamppost.
Right, I thought you were going to say she did a few more lampposts, not a few more miles. Well, that may be more to do with my running ability. But look, two great takeaways. And what I would say is I just want to say a huge thanks to you both for making yourselves available and throwing yourselves into a conversation. I think the one thing we've all kind of agreed on just before we flicked live is, it is a subject that is so big and so vast and so moving. Nobody's got all the answers. And I think what you've done today, and probably what everybody who's dialed into the webinar is doing, is I think it's about getting out there and having the conversation, sharing that lived experience, and kind of saying, look, this, we fell in a hole here, we worked this out here, and I think ultimately, I think that's got to be part of the solution, hasn't it? Building that external library. And trying to help each other. So thank you both for donating your time. Thanks to everybody who dialed in. Sorry we didn't get to some of the questions, but hopefully you can go and pick that conversation up in your own business and in your own network and continue it. Thanks for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Thank you very much.
If you found this video helpful for your recruitment journey, why not subscribe to our channel? And don't forget to tap the bell to get the latest videos first.